What's up everyone, it's Wizard101 back again with another Wiz video, and today I'm going to be talking about the Nightmare Dungeon, do a kind of retrospective talking about whether or not the nightmare was really the nightmare everyone was portraying it to be, or if its reputation was undeserved. I'll be mainly focusing on standard mode because that's the version most people have done and many people complain about. The whole point of challenge mode is to make a challenging dungeon, so if that's difficult or unbalanced there really isn't an issue present. Before we get started, I just want to say that 90% of you watching are not subscribed, so if you are a returning viewer or like the content, be sure to like or sub or join the Discord down below. Now let's get right into the video. First, I want to talk about the initial release of the Nightmare Dungeon. The dungeon was released in January of this year, with the only mode released on launch being challenge mode. There was an event to see who could beat the dungeon first, and challenge mode is technically advanced content, so it followed advanced content rules with Rochambeau rules and mini spells being banned. The first teams to beat this dungeon was a team from the guild Kittens consisting of Daryl Almond, Eric Dream, William Stormcloud, and Blake Titan Walker. This launch was controversial because Rochambeau was already very unpopular with the casual PvE community, especially after the final Novus fight, with players feeling like KI was forcing the new system down their throats, and raids especially being unpopular with the release of the Crying Sky raid, which is still the hardest content in the game to this day. Releasing challenge mode first was possibly the worst thing KingsIsle could have done in this situation, and the initial 25 wins required to craft the gear was just rubbing salt in the wounds of players who, in my opinion, were perfectly justified in being angry about advanced content being shoved down their throats when they really didn't want it to be. The initial release was so bad and so poorly received by players and creators that it triggered a sequence of events which led to a whole slew of things in this community, and I'm not touching any of that with a 10-foot pole. I have actually done challenge mode a few times. The first time I did challenge mode was on Val's stream after about 7 months of not touching the dungeon. I ended up throwing a few times, but we did end up getting a win. I was going to use footage of that run in this video, but it got corrupted. I've since done challenge mode a few more times with some friends in guilds and learned about stuff like sharing wisps among other things, and while I'm not an expert on challenge mode, I've done it consistently for the Dreamwater. Shout out double reagents. After ceremony was released, it has its own problems and complaints, but the devs were surprisingly quick to address them, and they even lowered the 25 win requirement for the badge down to 15, which was a welcome change to nearly everyone grinding the dungeon, including myself. KI also nerfs the Broken Dreams, which were a huge problem in challenge mode for people with high ping, especially those who lived outside the US, as it would literally get sniped by them from across the map. The main problem with standard mode after that though wasn't necessarily the difficulty. The nightmare itself was harder than any other PvE content up until that point, but wasn't unreasonable. The main problem was coordinating with people if you didn't have a group to play with. Personally, when I was getting Malice Rexes back in March, I didn't have people to play with. I wasn't a creator and I wasn't involved with Wiz communities on Discord, so I had to do the dungeon through team up. I was lucky enough to have someone show me the ropes on my first run and it went smoothly. It was the other runs that were a problem. It took 31 runs in total for me to get Malice Rexes with 15 wins. 16 of the runs were riddled with people leaving randomly, disconnecting, and some people were just throwing. There was this one time someone said they had Croc counters, and 20 minutes into Croc of them just stalling, they admitted that they had nothing and just left. Even the successful runs weren't entirely ideal either, as a lot of people would just dual box and make the run a lot less efficient on time, which is obviously very annoying. Usually dual boxing isn't much of a problem at all, but when each person is supposed to do an individual fight and you need to navigate a maze to get Dreamwater, it really slows you down. Even while recording nightmare footage for this video, I had a lot of instances of players throwing runs by not listening to others or just leaving the dungeon in the middle. I also had one run where I managed to drag it and DC'd. That's always very fun. The issue is not about the difficulty of the content. The issue with standard is that I expect randoms to come together and have good runs, which just isn't the case in most runs, especially when they do nothing to punish players who repeatedly leave the dungeon mid-run. I've had instances where the same person would leave the dungeon on different runs and their only punishment would be not being able to use team up for a few minutes. It got to the point where I reported a player who I saw in the dreaming right after just leaving the group mid-run twice in 2 separate runs with no explanation. The maze and Broken Dreams especially were things that people complain about in both challenge and standard mode. Broken Dreams as a concept were fine. They functioned kind of like Wisps of Misfortune from CSR, but they would slow you down when you got nearby and they had a much larger hitbox. The problem with them comes in when you are on anything less than optimal Wi-Fi. My first few runs at Nightmare were in my college dorm on university Wi-Fi. If I had to guess, I had upwards of 80 ping, maybe near 100, and at home I would have 20 ping, and the difference was monumental in how I was able to outmaneuver the Broken Dreams. TNT actually showed herself up playing the Nightmare, and the Dreams would hit her from basically across the map. Players with bad Wi-Fi or players who were far away in Europe or Asia or Australia in TNT's case were just doomed to not being able to do that dungeon. This video isn't going to be all negative though. there were definitely some positives that came out of the Nightmare. The first positive of the Nightmare was the pity system that Wallaru introduced. Being able to craft the gear with a droppable reagent after getting a badge was a great improvement over the Novus pity system, and even though obtaining that dream water was a grind, it wasn't unreasonable in my opinion like the Novus pity system was. The second thing KI did well was listen to community feedback on standard mode. They tweaked the broken dreams, and they also lowered the badge requirement from 25 wins to 15 wins, which was a great change, and it was surprising to see that the dev team was this receptive to feedback, as they usually aren't very quick to make changes. I do think that in the future it would be good to make it 10 wins if they release another dungeon this long though. The final positive is that with the Nightmare, KI made Pierce jewels and the newly added damage jewels highly accessible, with you being able to craft both with only 10 drain water for each jewel, as long as you have the respective badges, and you can even transfer them through your shared bank. At the Nightmare Crafter specifically, you can actually craft damage jewels for any school despite the school lock on these jewels, just something that could be useful. One thing that I think can be added onto this pity system, or the next one they introduced to make it even better though, is a recycling system, which I brought up in a previous video, and my friend Frenzy has also brought up in a KI live. In a system like this, you would be able to transmute the Dream Warper gear set, which is practically worthless, into Dream Water, which you could then use to craft the gear after getting the badges. This could hypothetically make lower tier gear sets actually serve a purpose other than being annoying clutter in your backpack or your bank. Of course, this wouldn't be something for the Nightmare anymore, as it's a bit late now, but for future pity systems, having something like a gear recycling system would be amazing. Now this leaves the final question. Was the Nightmare dungeon really that bad? Well, yes, but also no at the same time. Let me explain. The actual contents, like fights in standard mode, weren't that bad. At the base level, the dragon fight is just feint and blade stacking with someone using shatter once or twice. The Krok fight is the same thing, just slightly more annoying with counters, and once you have a decent setup with 2 people spamming dispels and the others buffing and hitting, the Malice fight is easy. But the maze is where most people get angry and quit. If you have high ping, the dreams will just snipe you from a mile away, and a lot of people I've been in the dungeon with will just refuse to learn the maze unless you're guiding them through it the whole time. One thing about a lot of players who ranted about how the Nightmare is easy and don't know why people complain about it is that they're disconnected from the rest of the player base because they're only doing it in groups, while most of the player base has to deal with team up, and in team up, a lot of the players you meet are far from competent. A lot of the people who are in guilds and only farm with their guildmates are unaware that they are in the minority. Most of the people who play with aren't in guilds and use team up to farm, and unless it's a raid, KI should be catering to that player base over hardcore players in guilds. I feel like in the future, if KI does something like the Nightmare again, they should also trash things like broken dreams in standard mode. If you have players who have high ping due to living outside the US or just having bad internet in general, it makes it much harder to do the dungeon in general, and you feel it especially when you need to find things like dream water, and if you're slow finding dream water, you just slow everyone down. The best thing the Nightmare did in my opinion though was definitely the pity system. I feel like they should keep improving on that, and it would make farming gear much easier. In the end, the Nightmare dungeon was a cool concept and probably the most unique dungeon KI has ever released if you don't count raids. It's very controversial for the new things to introduce, like the concept of obstacles within a dungeon as opposed to straight fights, taking concepts like the Wisps of Misfortune from the Crying Sky raid and making them into broken dreams, as well as the concept of tokens and wheels from the same raid and making them into the pump and the wheel within a Nightmare. In a lot of ways, the Nightmare was a mini raid, especially with challenge mode, and given how controversial raids are with some of the more casual player base, it's no secret to why the Nightmare is so despised, and I can't really blame anyone for disliking the dungeon. Personally, I don't like it either. I actually did a poll on my channel a couple weeks ago, and while a good chunk of people, 36%, described the Nightmare as not that bad, the options of awful dungeon and anti-casual weren't too far behind it at 29% and 30% respectively, and only 5% described the dungeon as enjoyable, which isn't a good ratio at all. Obviously, my audience doesn't represent the whole community, and it leans more towards the more casual to average Wiz players, but it's definitely an interesting statistic nonetheless. With the recent introduction of Selenopolis though, and how easy it is to farm in that gear in comparison, I think it's safe to say that the time of the Nightmare has come to an end due to the Selenopolis gear just being the better option for farming and more appealing overall if you don't already have the Reaper gear. Anyways, this is going to be the end of the video. I want to hear your own thoughts on the Nightmare now that it's approaching a year old, and your experiences with it, whether you ended up getting the badge or decided it wasn't worth it. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like or a sub, or to join the Discord in the description. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.